Richard Blackstone sat in his golden wheelchair, laughing so hard that tears ran down his face, his mansion echoing with cruel amusement as he pointed at the giant TV screen showing a Nigerian clinic, where patients were recovering using traditional herbal medicine. And while his servants tried to hide their discomfort, he shouted mockingly, "They think some African herbs can heal people. What a joke!" Even as his butler James hesitantly began, "Sir, maybe we should," only to be cut off by Richard's arrogant scoff. "Should what, James? Believe in magic? I've spent 40 years and billions making real medicine." But fate didn't care for pride, because just 3 hours later, Richard's life began to unravel when his wheelchair slammed into his priceless medicine cabinet, shattering glass and sending his life-sustaining pills scattering across the marble floor, prompting a frantic scream for James to call the lab, only for James to remind him, pale-faced, that the scientists were away for weeks, and as panic set in and mortality stared him in the face. The doorbell rang, and a rain-soaked 8-year-old African-American girl stood there alone, introducing herself as Amara, sent by her grandmother with a mysterious leather bag to help Mr. Blackstone, whose reaction was predictably dismissive and mocking until Amara, undeterred by wealth or rudeness, walked straight into his study, looked him in the eye, and calmly said, "You're scared," stunning the billionaire into silence as she explained that his blood was sick and her herbs could help, prompting an angry outburst until she replied with serene clarity, "My grandmother says angry people are usually just scared," and pulled from her bag dried roots and plants with an aroma of rain and earth, telling him healing required humility and open-mindedness, causing Richard to scoff again about weeds and factories until she reminded him that even his lab-made pills began as something from nature, a truth he'd never truly considered. And as she spoke of generations of women healers in her family and her ability to sense what someone's body needs, like hearing a song only she could hear, even the loyal James stepped forward to say, "What do you have to lose?" Because without his pills, he had 4 days to live, leading Richard to ask what Amara wanted in return if her treatment worked. And instead of demanding money, she asked for a promise to stop mocking plant medicine and help others learn its value. A request that stunned the man who thought money could buy everything. And as he finally drank her strange-smelling tea, feeling shame for perhaps the first time in his life, something miraculous happened. His breathing eased, color returned to his face, and he whispered, "This is impossible," to which Amara replied, "The plants are talking to your blood." And when he asked how she knew this would work, she simply smiled and said, "Because I trust the earth, and now so do you." And over the next few hours, Richard found himself staring at the child with a mix of awe and disbelief, for while his rational mind clung to decades of science and skepticism, his body could not deny the relief it felt, as though something ancient and pure had entered his bloodstream and rewritten the script of his decay. And when Amara explained that each plant carried not just chemical properties, but spiritual memory passed down through nature's own language, Richard began to listen, not because he was convinced, but because he was desperate, and desperation often opens the door that pride keeps shut. And so he allowed Amara to prepare more tea, to crush leaves with a mortar and pestle, as she whispered old prayers her grandmother had taught her. And as the scent filled the room, Richard felt the fog in his mind lifting, memories of his childhood, resurfacing days spent in the countryside before ambition hardened his heart, times when his own mother had once used peppermint for fever and ginger for colds, and it dawned on him that he hadn't always been this cynical, that he had once believed in simpler things before ego and empire consumed him. And on the second day, he slept deeply for the first time in years, his muscles no longer burning, his hands no longer trembling, and James, who had served him faithfully despite years of coldness and commands, looked on with quiet amazement as Richard woke up and, instead of barking an order, said softly, "James, thank you for staying." Words that made the old butler's eyes fill with tears, because in all his decades of service, kindness had been rare. And as Amara continued her work, harvesting Herbs from the greenhouse Richard had built for show but never used. She explained how different leaves needed different moonlight, how roots had voices if you knew how to listen, and Richard, to his own shock, began writing everything down, filling notebooks with her teachings, asking questions not with the arrogance of a CEO but the curiosity of a student. And on the third day, he asked to be wheeled outside to sit under the oak tree in his yard, the one he hadn't visited since his legs gave out. And he looked up at the branches with sunlight streaming through and whispered, "I never realized how sick my soul had become." And Amara simply sat beside him, placing a hand on his arm and saying, "That's where real healing starts." And by the fifth day, Richard could move his fingers without pain. His breathing was deep and steady, and when the hospital called to say a donor match had been found for an experimental treatment, he smiled and replied, "Thank you, but I've already begun a different kind of healing," shocking the medical team into silence. And that evening, he called his lawyer and said, "I want to set up a foundation, one that funds research into traditional healing, gives voice to forgotten wisdom, and brings real medicine to people who can't afford what I used to sell for profit." And when asked what to call it, Richard said, "The Rose Johnson Foundation," in honor of Amara's grandmother who once worked in his lab and whom he had dismissed as foolish, never knowing she was a genius of another kind. And as the days turned to weeks, his health continued to improve, and word began to spread of the miracle in the mansion. And journalists tried to get interviews, but Richard declined them all, choosing instead to host quiet meetings with doctors, herbalists, and healers from around the world, creating bridges between science and spirit, between data and tradition. And when Rose finally arrived, older and slower than before, but glowing with grace, she looked at Richard and said, "You've changed," to which he replied, "I've come home." And they sat for hours on the back patio, drinking tea made from her recipes, laughing about the past, and planning for the future. And soon, the mansion was no longer a monument to power, but a sanctuary for healing, filled with people learning, teaching, and growing. And Richard, once driven by profit and pride, now woke each morning with gratitude and wonder, knowing that the greatest transformation in his life came not from laboratories or stock markets, but from a little girl in the rain who dared to walk through his door with a bag of plants and the courage to believe in something most people had forgotten. Amara sat down next to Richard's wheelchair and said, "Can I tell you a secret?" And when he nodded, she revealed, "My grandmother had the same sickness as you. The doctors said she would die, but old plant medicine saved her. And she lived 20 more years," causing Richard's mind to race as he asked, "What was your grandmother's name?" To which Amara replied, "Rose Johnson, but her maiden name was Rose Okafor." And at that, Richard's face went pale because he remembered that name. Rose Okafor had worked in his first lab 3 decades ago, studying plant medicine before. He fired her for what he believed were foolish ideas. And now her granddaughter was the one saving his life, leaving him whispering, "Why? Why would she help me after what I did to her?" And Amara, with the calm wisdom far beyond her years, answered, "She said you were a good man who forgot how to be good, and everyone deserves a second chance." And when Richard, now weeping, confessed, "I ruined her career," Amara gently corrected him, saying, "No, you made her stronger. She opened her own clinic and helped thousands. She always said you taught her something important, that some people need to fall down before they can learn how to stand up." And the next morning Richard awoke feeling better than he had in years, his pain gone, color returning to his skin. And when he found Amara cooking breakfast with James, she smiled and asked, "How do you feel?" To which Richard, sitting at the kitchen table unaided for the first time in months, replied, "I feel ... amazing," before asking how she truly knew he needed help. And Amara explained softly that sometimes she could see when someone's light was flickering out, something passed down through generations in her family, something they called the sight, which startled James enough to drop his coffee. And just then the phone rang. Dr. Stevens calling urgently with news of a donor and a scheduled surgery. But Richard shocked him by saying, "I don't think I need the surgery anymore," prompting the doctor to rush over, only to find Richard healthier than he'd seen him in years, with perfect blood work. And when asked what had happened, Richard simply pointed to Amara and said, "She happened," then patiently explained that she had given him traditional African plant medicine that healed him. And although Dr. Stevens laughed in disbelief, Richard's tone turned serious as he explained that healing wasn't just about chemicals, but about the whole person, mind, body, and spirit, while Amara, overhearing, challenged Dr. Stevens on what aspirin, digitalis, and morphine were made from, leading him to admit all were originally derived from plants, which prompted her to ask, what if nature already made them perfect? And as Richard listened to this young girl debate a top medical expert and win, he was filled with awe and asked Dr. Stevens to run every test imaginable to document his recovery, and then said with a calm determination in his voice, "And then, I'm going to use everything I have, my company, my labs, my money, to prove the world was wrong about plant medicine, just like I was. Then we're going to change how the world thinks about medicine," Richard said with quiet conviction. And 3 days later, Dr. Stevens returned with a thick folder of test results, his expression stunned as he told Richard that every single marker for his rare blood disease was gone, not improved, but completely vanished, as if he had never been sick at all. And when Richard looked over at Amara, who was calmly teaching James how to make plant tea in the kitchen, Dr. Stevens added that Richard's overall health was better than it had been in 2 decades. With perfect blood pressure, excellent cholesterol, and even old injuries inexplicably healed, prompting James to ask in disbelief how such a thing was possible, to which Amara answered gently without even glancing up, "When you heal the root problem, everything else gets better too." And that evening Richard summoned his lawyers and accountants to establish a foundation with an initial endowment of $1 million to fund research into traditional plant medicines, naming it the Rose Johnson Foundation for Traditional Healing Research in honor of Amara's grandmother, who Richard acknowledged had saved his life twice, once by sending Amara, and once through the wisdom she had passed down. And he then announced plans to build healing centers in underserved communities where traditional healers and modern doctors could work side by side, inspiring Dr. Stevens to step forward and ask to be a part of the mission, admitting that what he'd witnessed had changed everything he thought he knew. And Amara beamed, saying her grandmother always believed that the best healing happened when people stopped fighting and started listening, to which Richard replied with deep regret that he wished he'd listened to her 30 years ago. And Amara responded softly, "You're listening now." The next morning, bringing an unexpected visitor, an older African-American woman with gray hair and kind eyes, Rose Johnson herself, who had returned from Nigeria and walked into Richard's mansion with the grace of a queen and the heart of a healer. And as Amara ran to embrace her grandmother, Richard was overcome with emotion and apologized, confessing how wrong he'd been and how deeply he regretted firing her, only to be met with a calm, forgiving voice as Rose told him she had let go of her anger long ago because holding on to it would have only stopped her from helping others. And she explained that being forced to leave his lab had led her to return to Nigeria, where she learned healing wisdom that labs could never teach. And when Richard offered to make amends by funding research and building clinics, Rose offered a deeper challenge, not just to study their medicine, but to truly understand their philosophy, emphasizing that traditional healing treats the whole person and sees illness as physical, emotional, and spiritual, which Dr. Stevens connected to the growing science on how stress and trauma impact health. And in the weeks that followed, Richard's home transformed into a living classroom where Rose taught not only the medicinal properties of plants, but the importance of compassion, attention, and love, often saying, "The most important medicine is human kindness," a lesson that made Richard reflect on the decades he had prioritized profits over people, prompting his realization that he had not been doing things wrong, just incompletely, and he decided to share his story with the world, holding a press conference where, instead of announcing a new drug, he appeared walking unaided onto the stage and shared how an 8-year-old girl and the knowledge of her ancestors had saved him, declaring that his company, Blackstone Pharmaceuticals, would now collaborate with traditional healers to develop treatments that blend ancient wisdom with modern science, shocking the media and angering some business partners and investors, causing a temporary drop in the company's stock. But Richard didn't care because for the first time in his life, he was doing what was right instead of what was profitable. And when Amara asked if he was worried about the backlash, Richard said no, he'd spent 40 years worrying about money, and now he was focused on something far more important, helping people, a sentiment that Rose affirmed as true healing. And just when it seemed like the whole world had turned against him, calls began pouring in from patients and families desperate for alternative treatments, asking him not to give up, sharing stories of illnesses that modern medicine couldn't cure. And within months, Richard opened his first integrative healing center where doctors and traditional healers worked in harmony. And the first patient, a boy with severe asthma, was treated by both Dr. Stevens and Rose, who observed that his lungs held fear from his parents' divorce and suggested healing his heart alongside his body, resulting in the boy breathing freely within weeks for the first time in years. And as word spread, more doctors came to learn, more healers came to teach, and more centers opened across the country, with Amara becoming a beloved figure in the movement, teaching children about plant medicines and showing adults that wisdom can come from any age, telling medical students, doctors are good at some things, healers are good at others, together, we're good at everything. And a year after the journey began, Richard was invited to speak at the World Health Organization's annual conference, where he stood before the world's top medical experts holding the same leather bag Amara had brought into his life, saying, "This bag contains plants that saved my life, but more than that, it contains wisdom that could save millions." And as he told his story again, now backed by clinical data, photos of recovered patients, and testimonies from skeptical doctors turned believers, the audience shifted from silence to awe to applause, because something in their hearts recognized the truth in his words, that healing is not just a science, it is a relationship between people, nature, and compassion. And Richard Blackstone, once the face of corporate medicine, had become its most unexpected healer. At the end of his presentation, a doctor from Germany stood up and challenged, "Mr. Blackstone, your story is impressive, but how do we know this wasn't just a coincidence? How do we know traditional medicine actually cured you?" To which Richard smiled, having anticipated the question, and responded confidently, "Doctor, you're right to be skeptical. That's why we've spent the last year conducting rigorous scientific studies, testing our integrated treatments on over 1,000 patients using control groups and double-blind protocols." Then proceeded to show slides of research data proving that patients treated with both modern and traditional medicine recovered 40% faster and had 60% fewer relapses than those treated with modern methods alone, triggering a wave of applause from a once skeptical audience now eager to learn more. And after the session, Richard was swarmed by medical professionals, but the person he was happiest to see was Amara, who wrapped him in a hug and said, "I'm proud of you," to which Richard replied, "I'm proud of us. None of this would have happened without you and your grandmother." And Rose, standing nearby, added with a soft smile, "And none of this would have happened without you being brave enough to change your mind." But, despite the success, there was a cost. Richard had lost friends and business partners who saw his transformation as betrayal, and one evening, his brother Tom called and angrily questioned, "What's happened to you?" "You're chasing fairy tales," to which Richard replied with quiet resolve, "These aren't fairy tales, Tom. They're real people getting real help." And when Tom hung up in disbelief, Amara found Richard in his study, saddened and gently comforted him, saying, "My grandmother says when you choose to help people, some people will leave. but others will find you and love you for who you truly are. And right on cue, James entered to announce visitors at the door: patients, doctors, families whose lives had been touched by Richard's foundation, including Mrs. Peterson and Dr. Stevens, all there to express gratitude. And among them, to Richard's surprise, was Tom, who apologized and confessed he'd visited one of the healing centers for chronic back pain and had finally found relief through integrated care, prompting an emotional hug between the brothers. And 2 years after his healing, Richard opened a school where children like Amara could study both modern science and traditional healing, combining chemistry, anatomy, and botany with empathy, meditation, and the art of listening, with Rose explaining, "Our goal is to raise healers who see the whole person, body, mind, and spirit." And on the 3rd anniversary of his healing, Richard hosted a celebration filled with patients, doctors, and children, where Amara, now 11, stood before the crowd and said, "3 years ago, Mr. Richard was sick in his body and heart. The plants healed his body, but learning to care about others healed his heart." And a decade later, the Richard Blackstone Foundation had opened centers in 50 countries, training thousands of integrated practitioners and helping millions. With Richard, Rose, and Amara, now a 21-year-old healer and medical student, traveling the globe, sharing wisdom and bridging worlds. And one day, as they sat by a river in Ghana, Richard mused, "I used to think success meant wealth and power. Now I know it means making the world better than you found it." And Rose, smiling, added, "The best medicine isn't in a lab, it's in kindness, in nature's gifts, and in the courage to admit when you've been wrong." And as the sun set, Richard looked at Amara and Rose and thought about the journey that began with a child at his doorstep and a leather bag full of herbs, realizing he had gained not just health, but purpose, family, and the humbling truth that true healing starts with an open heart and the willingness to listen to the wisdom of those we often overlook. And so, as Richard stood beneath a golden sky beside the river, where children laughed and trees swayed with the wisdom of the earth, he knew that his life had come full circle, not just healed, but transformed. He was no longer the man who scoffed at ancient knowledge or chased profit without purpose, but someone who had learned that true power lies not in money or medicine alone, but in humility, compassion, and the courage to listen. With Rose's steady guidance and Amara's fearless light, he had built something far greater than a pharmaceutical empire. He had helped create a global movement rooted in respect, unity, and healing that honored both science and spirit. And as the world slowly changed, one clinic, one patient, one heart at a time, Richard Blackstone smiled, knowing that what began with a fall from pride had risen into a legacy of hope, proving that sometimes the greatest miracles come not from what we know, but from who we're finally willing to believe in. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think differently about healing and hope, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with someone who needs a reminder that change is always possible. Hit the bell icon so you never miss more powerful stories that blend heart, wisdom, and transformation. Your support helps us keep telling stories that matter.